They pushed my chair to the wall, right next to the recycling bin. At Christmas, that's the kind of sentence that should come with an earthquake or a slap, but it came with cranberry sauce and polite laughter. It came with, "Just for now, Mom, until we get more space," and "That's the only spot where there's room for the extra chair." It came with Marianne's perfect voice, always just a little too smooth, like glass over rotten fruit. I didn't say anything. I sat. I nodded. I smiled the way they wanted me to smile. You learn that over time, how to be the quiet decoration in someone else's holiday. I'm 81 now. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that smells like soap and burnt lint. There's no fireplace, no garland on the walls, no mantle with stockings, just a narrow window and a folding chair where I sometimes drink my tea and pretend the sound of the washing machines below is the sea. But once, not so long ago, I was the one who hosted Christmas. I was the one who ironed the linen napkins until they were crisp enough to crack. I roasted turkeys the size of infants and made gravy from scratch. I set the table with name cards, not because anyone forgot where they sat, but because it made them feel special. I made people feel special. That was my gift. It's funny how fast that turns into an obligation, into a joke, into invisibility. The first year after Charles died, they were gentle. They invited me early and let me bring my famous sweet potato bake. The next year, Marianne said she'd handle everything and maybe I should just bring myself. I told her I'd make cranberry sauce, the real kind with orange zest and cinnamon, and she smiled like I'd offered to bring a dead fish. "We already have some," she said. "The canned kind is what the kids are used to." That was the same year they got the new dining table. Glass and chrome, sleek, modern, cold. It seated 8, maybe 10 if you were thin. But we were 13 that year, and I was given the overflow seat, the folding chair, the extra. No one said it out loud, of course. No one said, "You're not important enough to plan for." They just let it show in the way no one noticed my plate had no butter knife or that my water glass was a mismatched plastic one from the kids' cupboard. They made sure the wine flowed and the playlist hummed and the photos looked good for social media, but no one asked me to take a photo with them. I was in the room, but not in the memories. It started like that, small things. You never notice the first shadow until it becomes the whole sky. This past Christmas, I wore the sweater Leah gave me 2 years ago, the one with little reindeer and a neckline that made me itch. She used to be the only one who sat with me after dinner, who asked me stories about how I met her grandfather, how her father used to cry when he scraped his knees. But now she's 16, and her phone is the only face she wants to look at. Still, I wore the sweater. Still, I brought a tin of cookies, even though no one asked. I'd bake them the old way, just like my mother taught me. Brown sugar, a pinch of salt, and never margarine. I tied the tin with a gold ribbon, thinking maybe, just maybe, someone would say, "You still make the best cookies." But when I placed it on the counter, Marianne smiled without teeth and said, "Oh, we've got plenty already, but thanks." She moved it behind a bag of sourdough and a tray of store-bought macaroons. I didn't see it again. They had 2 tables that year, the main table in the dining room and the kids' table in the living room. I wasn't assigned to either. They brought in the metal chair again, set it by the wall near the window in the draft, where the fake tree leaned slightly like it had lost the will to stand straight. They placed a TV tray in front of me, not even a real table. I balanced my plate on my lap and smiled through the cold air on my ankles and the muffled jokes from the kitchen. The grandkids passed by me like I was a coat rack. My son, my only son, poured wine for everyone else and didn't ask if I wanted any. At one point, I stood up to help with the dishes, and Marianne said, No, no, just rest. We've got it. But it wasn't kindness. It was dismissal. They didn't want me in the kitchen, didn't want me in the photos, didn't want me in the way. And I realized, really realized, that I was not part of the celebration. I was furniture. I was background. I watched as they opened presents, big boxes with ribbons and tags and receipts tucked safely underneath. They clapped for each other, exaggerated surprise and laughter. I handed my envelope to Leah quietly, the one with the savings bond and the note in my handwriting. For books or for freedom, whichever comes first. Love always, Nana. She smiled and thanked me, but her eyes didn't meet mine. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket like it was a receipt. I felt old in a way that had nothing to do with years. I felt like a ghost. Not the spooky kind, just the kind people build traditions around and then forget to invite. I watched as they admired the new fondue set that Marianne's brother gave her. As they unwrapped matching flannel pajamas and board games no one would ever play. I watched, and I didn't say a word. But I had brought something else. A small package in my purse, wrapped in plain gold paper with a thin brown ribbon. I hadn't labeled it. I hadn't told anyone. It was the last family heirloom, my mother's locket, the one with the tiny photo of her and my father, the one I wore at my wedding. For years they'd hinted. Maybe one day you'll pass it down, Marianne once said with a wink. It would be so sweet if Leah got it. I had planned to give it that night. But as I sat near the recycling bin, half behind a plastic snowman and an extension cord, I realized something. You don't give the last piece of yourself to people who pushed your chair to the wall. You don't hand over memory to those who treat you like a fire hazard. You don't give family to people who treat you like a favor. So I reached into my purse and held the little package in my lap. I didn't open it. I didn't announce it. I just sat with it there while they scraped plates into the trash and laughed about ski trips and traffic and how next year we'll book a cabin in Tahoe instead. And I thought, maybe I'll keep it. Maybe I'll sell it. Maybe I'll leave it in a shoebox with a note that says, for the one who remembers to give me a chair with a cushion. That night, I didn't wait for dessert. I didn't wait for goodbye hugs. I stood up slowly, coat over my arm, purse heavy with the locket, and I walked out. No one followed. No one noticed. The snow was falling sideways, soft and sharp. I walked past the lit windows, past the garlands and wreaths, and I didn't look back. They had Christmas. They had the feast, the fire, the fondue. I had the gift they all wanted, and I kept it, not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but because for the first time in years I remembered. Some things you don't give away unless they've earned it. They didn't even notice I had left. That was the most revealing part. I waited. Outside their house, beneath the brittle Christmas lights strung too tightly across the porch, I waited for someone to step out, call my name, say, "Mom? Are you all right?" But the door stayed closed. The laughter inside went on, muffled but bright, the sound of people enjoying themselves uninterrupted. My boots sank into the soft crust of snow that had fallen while we'd been pretending to be a family. I held my coat around me and walked to the end of the street where the ice hadn't been cleared and the sidewalk sloped toward the gutter. There was no plan. I hadn't stormed out. I wasn't angry in the way they always imagined I might be if I ever spoke up. Dramatic, accusatory, unhinged. Number. I was something much quieter. I was done. I walked for 2 blocks before I realized I was still carrying the tin of cookies I'd brought. I hadn't even opened it at the house. It was still wrapped, still tied with a ribbon, a tag dangling off the side that read, "With love, always." It struck me then as painfully funny that I had made those cookies with the same hands that had swaddled my son when he was a colicky newborn, the same hands that had cut the crusts off his sandwiches in the shape of stars, that had stitched his Halloween costumes by hand when we couldn't afford store-bought ones. Those hands had stirred, rolled, and baked for a family that now treated me like an optional accessory, something you take out once a year, pose near the fireplace, and quietly return to storage when the company leaves. The snow picked up. I wasn't dressed for the cold, not really. My coat was warm but thin, more suited for moving from car to house than wandering city streets. I turned onto a quieter road, past houses with their blinds drawn and wreaths hanging symmetrically on glass-paneled doors. Each window glowed like a scene from a movie. Couples setting out china, children in pajamas dragging new toys, grandmothers smiling beside their husbands, as if age came with guarantees. But behind one window, I saw an older woman sitting alone with a plate on her lap and a glass of wine. She was watching something on the television. She looked content, or maybe resigned. It was hard to tell from the street. I stood there for a long moment and realized I wasn't jealous of the ones with big tables and loud dinners. I was envious of her, because at least she was alone on her own terms. Eventually, I made my way to the bus stop. I didn't even check the schedule. I just sat on the cold metal bench beneath the awning and waited. It was nearly midnight. The streets were mostly empty, the kind of stillness that only happens on holidays, when everyone's tucked inside the illusion of closeness. A man passed by walking his dog, a golden retriever with a red scarf, and gave me a polite nod. I nodded back. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't need to. I must have looked like what I was, a woman sitting in the consequences of 100 small silences. The bus arrived. It hissed to a stop, and the driver blinked at me like he wasn't sure I was real. "You getting on?" he asked. I nodded, stepped inside, swiped my card. There was only one other passenger, a young man in a hoodie asleep against the window. I took a seat near the middle and watched as the world moved by in shadow and frost. I didn't know where I was going. That was the truth, but I knew I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to that chair by the wall, not to a family that had decided I was too much to include, but not enough to grieve. At the transfer station, I stepped off, walked to a corner coffee shop still open for the late-night crowd. The girl behind the counter was no older than 20. She looked at me with kind curiosity, like maybe she wondered what I was doing there but didn't want to intrude. "You want something warm?" she asked. I ordered tea. I sat by the window and watched the street, the snow, the occasional headlights slicing through the dark. I thought of calling someone, but I couldn't think of a single person who wouldn't ask, "What happened now?" or "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" I wasn't overreacting. I was finally reacting. At some point, I opened my purse and took out the gold-wrapped box. I untied the ribbon. I opened it. The locket gleamed in the dim light, that small oval piece of memory, the only thing left from my mother that hadn't been buried or donated. I ran my thumb over the clasp and opened it. The photo inside was faded, sepia-toned, soft at the edges, but still clear enough to see the smile in my mother's eyes. The same smile she wore when she told me on the day I got married, "Don't let anyone take pieces of you for granted. Not even the ones who love you. Especially not them." I had forgotten that. I had forgotten so many things. I closed the locket, placed it back in the box, and put it into my coat pocket. Then I pulled out my wallet and stared at the bank card I hadn't used in years. It was from an account I kept hidden, not for secrets, just for safety. Derek and I opened it when Adam was 13, back when we still believed that saving for a rainy day meant something. I hadn't touched it since Derek died, but maybe this counted as rain. I searched train departures on my phone. There was one leaving at dawn, a slow train, northbound, long haul, no frills. I bought the ticket. I didn't think twice. I finished my tea, walked back into the snow, and found a cab. The driver didn't ask questions. He took me to the station. I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by sleeping travelers and flickering vending machines. At one point, I closed my eyes and imagined Marianne realizing I'd left. I imagined her scanning the room, looking at the empty chair, the missing purse. I imagined her shrugging, or maybe saying, "She's probably just in the bathroom." I imagined her saying nothing at all. The train arrived on time. I climbed aboard with the others, the tired, the disillusioned, the in-between. I found my seat and placed my bag on my lap like armor. Outside, the sky began to bleed pale pink. The holiday was ending. A new day was beginning. I wasn't sure what I would find where I was going, but for the first time in years, I wasn't being taken somewhere. I was going. The train moved like an old man remembering how to walk. Slow at first, a shuddering lurch, then a rhythm you could settle into if you stopped trying to control it. I sat by the window, my purse gripped against my side, and watched the landscape shift from suburb to field to forest, each frame of winter scenery passing like a faded memory. No one asked me anything. No one offered coffee or commentary, and for the first time in what felt like decades, I didn't have to explain myself. I wasn't anyone's mother, anyone's guest, anyone's problem to manage. I was just a woman on a train with a one-way ticket and a locket in her coat pocket. That anonymity felt sacred. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to cry about. Grief, in its most mature form, is not loud. It doesn't beg to be seen. It just sits beside you like an old friend, reminding you what you already know, that you are alone, that you are free. By the time we pulled into Portland, the sky had gone from dusty rose to slate gray. It was early evening, the kind of light that doesn't feel like a beginning or an end, just a suspension. I stepped off the train with no plan beyond motion. The air bit at my face, and I wrapped my scarf higher, clutching my small suitcase like it contained something precious, which it did. My second-best shoes, a pill box, a paperback I hadn't finished, and a set of pajamas I'd almost left behind. I stood on the platform for a long time, watching people reunite. Young men hugging tired mothers, toddlers running clumsily into arms, couples kissing with the urgency of apology or promise. No one was waiting for me. That was the point. I walked toward the taxi line and gave the driver the address of a motel I remembered from decades ago, a low-slung building with brown doors and faded signage that hadn't changed since Derek and I stayed there in the spring of '81 when we got stranded after a flat tire. I didn't know if it still existed. It did. It was $64 a night and smelled like wet carpet and cigarettes disguised by floral cleaner. But the sheets were clean, the door locked properly, and the heater made a sound like a tired engine trying its best. I lay on the bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until sleep took me without permission. The next morning, I woke before dawn. My body still followed the rhythm of responsibility. Years of making coffee before anyone else rose, packing school lunches, setting out vitamins for a husband who stopped taking them halfway through the bottle. I moved quietly, out of habit, as if someone might scold me for noise. No one did. The silence was a companion now, not a punishment. I made coffee in the tiny in-room machine. It tasted like melted plastic, but it was hot, and I wrapped my hands around the cup like it was a truth I'd forgotten to hold. I went for a walk. My knees ached from the cold, but I didn't rush. The streets were unfamiliar and familiar at once, like seeing an old acquaintance you can't place. I passed a bakery with fogged-up windows and the smell of yeast and sugar leaking through the doorframe. I stepped inside. The woman behind the counter had the sturdy, no-nonsense look of someone who didn't care what you used to be, only what you needed now. She asked if I wanted anything warm. I ordered a scone and paid in cash, exact change. "You new in town?" she asked. "Not exactly," I said. "Just new to being alone." She nodded, like she'd heard that one before, or something close enough. On the way out, I noticed a corkboard near the door with handwritten notes pinned in chaotic rows. Babysitting services, used furniture, guitar lessons. One stood out. Room for rent, quiet house, no drama, $400 per month. Call Joyce. The name was printed in block letters, like someone trying very hard to be understood. I took a photo of the number, though I didn't know why. I walked until my legs begged me to stop. I sat in a park near a school playground and watched two squirrels fight over an acorn like it was gold. No one called me. I hadn't turned my phone on. I wasn't avoiding anyone. I just didn't want to hear their confusion masquerading as concern, their guilt trimmed in polite rage. By late afternoon, I called the number. The woman who answered sounded like someone who'd smoked too long and trusted too little. "You clean?" she asked. "Yes." "No boyfriends?" "Not since Reagan." She laughed. "You can come by." 4:00. Don't be late. The address was 15 blocks away. I arrived 10 minutes early and waited by a blue gate covered in wind chimes. The house was weathered, like it had been holding itself up out of stubbornness, not structure. Joyce opened the door in slippers and a sweatshirt that said, "Don't ask." She looked me up and down. "You, the old lady?" "I suppose I am." "Come on in. Let's see if you're tolerable." The room was small, twin bed, a dresser with 3 working drawers, a window that let in tired light. The house smelled like onions and floor polish. There was no charm to it, just reality. I handed her $400 in 20s from the envelope I'd hidden in the lining of my purse. She didn't count it. "You hungry?" she asked. I nodded. She made grilled cheese and tomato soup and didn't ask a single question about who I'd been or what I was doing there. That was the first kindness I'd received in months that didn't come with an implied deadline. Over the next few days, I began to take up space again. I folded my few clothes into the drawers. I bought tea. I swept the hallway without being asked. Joyce didn't hover. She grunted approval when I fixed the curtain rod and passed me half a sandwich without comment when I skipped lunch. We were not friends, not yet, but she was company, and that was enough. I began looking at job boards, not because I needed money. I could stretch my savings if I stayed small, but because I needed motion, purpose, something to put my hands on that wasn't the past. A small cafe 3 blocks away had a sign in the window, "Help Wanted, mornings only." I walked in and asked. The woman behind the counter, Heather, had forearms like steel and a gaze like she'd already been disappointed by everyone once. "You got experience?" she asked. "I've made coffee, fed people, and not called in sick for 50 years. She raised an eyebrow. "Trial shift tomorrow, 6 to 11. Don't be late." That night, I ironed the only blouse I owned that still held a crease. I set out my shoes, the sturdy ones. I slept better than I had in weeks. In the morning, I arrived early. Heather handed me an apron and pointed. "No perfume. No opinions. Refill cups without being asked." I nodded. She softened just a breath. You nervous? No, I said. I'm 81. I've buried a husband, raised a son who hasn't called me in 2 months, and passed 3 kidney stones. This is just coffee. She smirked. Fair enough. By noon, my feet ached, but I was still standing. No one asked why I was working. No one questioned my hands. And when Heather handed me a towel and said, "Same time tomorrow?" I felt something in my chest unclench. I walked home slowly, the cold biting at my cheeks, my coat wrapped tight, and my steps heavy but honest. No one knew where I was. No one had called, but I had survived another day without being anyone's burden. That, to me, was everything. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I had touched something that was purely mine until I folded that first paycheck into my wallet. It was only $74 and change, wrinkled bills in a cheap envelope with my name scrawled in blue ink on the front, but it felt like gold. Not because of the money, but because of what it meant, that I still existed outside of them, outside of the family who only remembered me when they needed a babysitter, a casserole, or a place to store resentment. I walked straight from the cafe to the bank, my coat still carrying the smell of eggs and burnt toast, and asked the teller, barely old enough to rent a car, to break it down into small bills. She looked at me like I was confused. I wasn't. I just wanted the satisfaction of counting them, feeling their edges, knowing I could buy something, anything, without asking or explaining or apologizing. Across from the bank was a second-hand clothing shop with a chalkboard sign out front. Fall sale, 20% off all coats. I walked in without knowing what I was looking for. The girl behind the counter gave me a real smile. Not the strained politeness of family obligation, but something simpler, easier. The smile you give a stranger when you want nothing from them. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked. I opened my mouth to say no, then heard myself say, "Something that makes me feel like myself again." She didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She just nodded and gestured to the back racks. I found it tucked between a pile of oversized parkas and thin wool jackets, a navy coat with a subtle herringbone pattern, wide lapels, and deep, deep pockets. I tried it on. It fit. Not just physically, but emotionally, like armor, like memory, like the kind of weight that makes you stand up straighter, because it carries your history without shame. I paid in cash. The girl wrapped it carefully in tissue and said, "You look sharp." I looked her in the eye and said, "Thank you. I feel sharp." That night, I wore it home, even though the weather didn't require it. I wanted to feel the weight of it on my shoulders, to hear the whisper of its fabric as I walked. Joyce was sitting on the porch, a coffee mug of red wine in her hand, her cat Franklin curled like a judgmental slipper at her feet. "Look at you," she said, eyeing the coat. "You steal that from a senator?" "Nope," I said. "Bought it with my own money." She raised her mug. "To women who buy their own damn coats." We went inside, split a can of chili, and sat with our legs propped on the coffee table like teenagers who hadn't yet learned about disappointment. I didn't tell her how the coat made me feel. I didn't have to. Some things are understood in silence. The days began to shape themselves. I worked mornings at the cafe, finding rhythm and repetition, fill the cups, clear the plates, wipe the counters, listen when people talk, but don't ask questions they don't want to answer. Heather didn't offer compliments, but she began saving me the crossword from the newspaper and once handed me a wrapped cinnamon roll with the words, "Too many leftovers," that meant, "I thought of you." After work, I'd walk home past the lilac bush, outside Mrs. Hendricks's yard, the same one I'd once passed in a different decade on my way to doctor's appointments or grocery runs, back when Derek was alive and Adam still called me Mom without sounding like he was checking a box. Joyce let me be. She didn't pry. She just poured tea in mismatched mugs and complained about city council. Sometimes she'd pass me a plate of toast without asking if I was hungry. Sometimes she'd leave me a folded newspaper on the table with a post-it that said, "Your kind of story," and it always was. One Sunday, I allowed myself to sleep in. When I came downstairs, Joyce was on the porch reading a gardening magazine with a pen tucked behind her ear, like she was preparing to argue with the articles. "You off today?" she asked. "Yes." "Good," she said. "You look like someone who forgot what rest feels like." I didn't disagree. Instead, I made coffee and sat beside her, both of us wrapped in old blankets, watching the sky shift from gray to something nearly blue. The silence wasn't heavy. It was a resting place. I thought of turning on my phone, checking for messages, seeing if Adam had noticed I was gone. But I didn't. I wasn't ready to let their noise back in. Instead, I opened a blank notebook I'd found in the dresser and began writing. Not letters, not stories, just fragments. Things I remembered. My mother's laugh. The way Derek used to hum when he made pancakes. The day Adam brought home a frog in his lunchbox and cried when I asked him to let it go. I wrote these things not to preserve them, but to remind myself they were mine. No one could edit them. No one could rewrite them into something more palatable for dinner conversation. I wrote until my hand ached, and then wrote some more. When I finally stopped, the sky had gone pale again, and Joyce was asleep in her chair, her mouth slightly open, Franklin tucked under her arm like a secret. Later that evening, I lit a candle on my nightstand, not for mood, but for company. The room was small, but it held everything I needed. My coat, my notebook, a few clothes folded with intention, and silence I chose. I placed the locket on the dresser, open, the tiny photograph staring out at me with a kind of enduring kindness. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. Maybe I'd keep it. Maybe I'd mail it to Leah with a letter she wasn't old enough yet to understand. Or maybe I'd carry it with me every day as a reminder that value isn't something other people assign to you. It's something you claim. Outside, rain tapped against the window like it had something gentle to say. I didn't feel old. I didn't feel lost. I felt new in a way I hadn't felt since before I was a wife, a mother, a placeholder. I was still rebuilding, yes, but I was building for myself this time. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was tucked among a pile of flyers and grocery store coupons Joyce had brought in from the mailbox. The usual mess of things people send when they don't really want to know how you are, but want to remind you they exist. At first, I thought it was just another bill, another printout, disguised as something personal, until I saw the handwriting. Precise, sharp, slanted to the right, like someone trying very hard to stay calm. There was no return address, but I recognized it instantly. My son, Adam. My fingers hesitated over the envelope, not from fear, but from fatigue. The kind of deep cellular weariness that comes not from one blow, but from hundreds of small ones, unspoken, accumulated over years, until your bones begin to echo with them. I opened it slowly, sitting at the small kitchen table, while Joyce muttered about a loose pipe under the sink, and read every word with a stillness I hadn't known I possessed. 6 pages. 6 full pages of accusation disguised as concern, of rewritten history sealed with the stamp of entitlement. He wrote that they were devastated, that my disappearance had traumatized the family, that Lisa cried every night, that the grandchildren were confused and distressed. He used words like abandoned, irrational, selfish, and he did it with the Careful cruelty of someone who believes himself reasonable. But what stood out most wasn't the language. It was the absences. Nowhere in 6 pages did he mention that they had left me by the recycling bin. Nowhere did he acknowledge the cold folding chair, the TV tray, the fact that no one had noticed when I slipped out into the snow. There was no apology, not even a shallow one. There was only the expectation that I should explain myself for leaving the very people who had quietly, efficiently, and without hesitation removed me from their lives long before I ever walked out the door. I folded the letter neatly and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't tear it. I didn't burn it. I left it in the drawer next to my notebook, under a receipt from the secondhand store and a spare key to the cafe. It didn't deserve fire. Fire is for things that matter. 2 days later, Kieran called. My grandson. The only one who used to visit without being asked, who once sat on my porch with a sketchbook and drew birds while I weeded the garden. His voice cracked when I answered, soft and tentative, like a child knocking on a door he's not sure he's allowed to open. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just said, "I'm glad you picked up." I told him I was safe, that I was working mornings, that I lived in a room with a window that caught the afternoon light in just the right way. He asked if I needed anything, and I laughed, not cruelly, just lightly, like someone who's been starving and is offered a brochure for a restaurant. "No, darling," I said. "I've got more than I did before." We talked for 15 minutes, about nothing and everything. I didn't mention the letter from his father. I didn't want to. I wasn't ready to share that wound, not even with him. Before we hung up, he said, "I miss you." And I said it back, because it was true. The next week, Lisa appeared at the cafe. She didn't come in right away. I saw her through the front window, standing stiffly near the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu. She looked thinner than I remembered, her coat too elegant for the drizzle, her expression practiced. When she finally stepped inside, the bell above the door sounded like a warning. I was wiping down the counter. She approached like someone approaching a wild animal, slow and careful, and ready to bolt. "Martha," she said, her voice low and precise. "Can we talk?" I gestured to the booth in the back. She sat like she wasn't sure the seat was clean. I didn't rush to join her. I finished cleaning the counter, refilled the sugar caddies, and only then walked over and sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap like I used to when waiting for school conferences. "It wasn't my idea to send the lawyer," she began, eyes flicking down to her gloves. "That was Adam. I didn't even know he'd done it until after." I didn't respond. I waited. "We didn't mean for you to feel excluded. It was Christmas. The house was crowded. We thought you were just tired, that you needed a break." I looked at her, really looked, and saw the effort it took for her to sit across from me. Not because of guilt, but because of the loss of control. Lisa had always been about the image, the narrative, the structure. She didn't know how to handle the unpredictable. She reached into her purse and slid a small envelope across the table. "It's from Kieran. He didn't know I was coming. I just thought..." I didn't touch it. Not yet. She looked up at me then, her eyes bright and hard. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." That was the closest thing to truth I'd ever heard from her. I stood, slowly, and leaned in just enough for her to hear me. "I'm not your shadow, Lisa. I'm the light you tried to dim because it made you squint." She didn't follow me when I walked away. That night, I opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of Kieran as a child, maybe 6 years old, in my backyard, holding a watering can twice the size of his arm, dirt on his cheeks, joy on his face. Behind him, I was kneeling by the hydrangeas, reaching out to guide his hand. The second item in the envelope was a note, just 5 words, written in Kieran's slanted hand. I remember. I always remembered I pressed the photo to my chest and let the ache move through me like music. It wasn't regret. It wasn't grief. It was recognition. The world hadn't erased me completely. Not yet. A week later, the man in the suit arrived. He waited outside the cafe until my shift ended, then stepped inside and said my name like it was a formality. Mrs. Harlow, I'm Derek Sorensen. I represent Adam and Lisa Harlow. They're concerned about your well-being. I looked him in the eye and said, I'm not a dog who wandered off a leash. He cleared his throat and tried again. They're worried. They just want to ensure you're in a safe environment. I am, I said. I pay rent. I work. I sleep well, better than I have in years. He nodded, but he didn't leave. They would like to discuss next steps. I folded my apron and set it on the counter. There are no next steps unless I take them. You can tell them that. Then I walked past him and out the door, my coat heavy and warm around my shoulders, the sky split open with soft rain that didn't touch me. Later that evening, I wrote one more letter. Not to Adam, not to Lisa, but to the lawyer. 3 sentences, formal and final. I am of sound mind and in a safe environment. I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. I signed it with a steady hand, sealed it, and mailed it the next morning. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt quiet, resolved, whole. That week, Arthur brought me a magnet shaped like a birdhouse. Saw it at the market, he said. Made me think of you. I thanked him. Later, I stuck it on the fridge and smiled. Not because of what it meant to him, but because of what it meant to me. A reminder that I was still here, still worthy of thought, still visible. That night, I sat with Joyce on the porch, the sky soft and low. She passed me the wine mug. You still hiding? She asked. Or healing? I didn't hesitate. Healing, I said, but the hiding was nice while it lasted. She nodded, and we didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. We didn't need to. Some truths are best left to float in silence, like leaves on still water. It happened on a Tuesday morning that smelled like burnt toast and oversteeped tea. I had just finished wiping down the pastry case at the cafe when Heather walked in early from her cigarette break, handed me a manila envelope, and said with a shrug, Guy dropped it off. Said it was from your son. I held it like something warm that might burn, staring at the heavy paper, the expensive embossed return address, a firm, not a person, a name I recognized, not Adams, but the firm he'd used when Derek died, the one that processed the estate, the one that whispered, let's be efficient, while I was still wiping grief off my mouth like lipstick. I didn't open it at the cafe. I put it in my purse, finished my shift, washed my hands with a trembling that didn't reach my face, and walked home with the weight of finality pressing between my shoulder blades. Joyce wasn't home. The living room was quiet, the kind of quiet that suggests the house is holding its breath. I sat down at the kitchen table and slid my thumb beneath the seal. Inside were documents, legal, numbered, sterile, a draft of a motion, custody request, conservatorship application. The language was cold and dressed in the formal armor of concern, but the message was clear. They wanted control of me, of my finances, of my future, of the story they told the world. They had tried distance, guilt, silence, letters, visits, lawyers. Now they would try paperwork. I read every word without blinking. It was, in essence, an accusation disguised as protection. They cited my absence, my age, my sudden departure from the family. They mentioned my employment at the cafe, phrased it in a way that made it sound like a symptom of instability. They questioned my living arrangement, described Joyce's home as unregulated. They used words like vulnerable, deteriorating, at risk. There was no mention of the Christmas chair, no mention of the folding tray, the invisible place setting, the ignored departure, only implication, construction, a carefully staged portrait of me as someone who had lost the thread. But I hadn't lost anything. I had finally picked it up. I didn't cry. Instead, I stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled down the tin of cookies I'd never eaten, the ones from that last Christmas. I opened it. They had gone stale, soft at the edges, fragile. I took one, broke it in half, placed the pieces on a plate, and sat again. Then I called the number on the last business card my own lawyer had given me, back when Derek was sick and we needed to update the will. His name was Clive. He had been patient, dull, methodical, the kind of man who looked at every comma like it owed him money. He picked up on the second ring. "Martha," he said, voice warm with distant memory. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you again." I told him everything. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "You don't need to worry. They can't make this stick, but we'll file a formal response. Do you want to go to court?" I looked out the window at Joyce's chimes clinking in the breeze. "If they push," I said, "I'll push back." I'm done folding. That week, I wrote a letter, not to Adam, not to Lisa, to Leah, my granddaughter. She was always the quiet one, the reader, the child who noticed when I wore a new pin or changed my hair. I wrote longhand, careful and slow. I didn't explain everything, just enough. I told her that being a mother doesn't end, even when your child stops seeing you as a person. That being a woman means being judged for your strength and your silence in equal measure. I told her that inheritance isn't just jewelry and bonds, it's behavior. That if you teach people to ignore you long enough, they will. That love without respect is just control in a prettier dress. I sealed the letter and included the locket. No note, no conditions, just the object and the truth. When the court date came, I arrived early, wearing the navy coat with the deep pockets. Clive met me outside with his usual beige tie and his weathered briefcase full of precision. Inside, the room was colder than I expected, all wood and glass and echoes. Adam was there, of course. Lisa sat beside him, perfectly composed, every inch of her hair telling the world that nothing was out of place. He looked older, tired, but not ashamed, just convinced that I had failed some invisible test of gratitude, convinced that I had slipped beyond usefulness into something inconvenient. The judge asked questions. I answered clearly, calmly, directly. Clive presented my employment records, my lease agreement, my medical statements. He read the letter Adam had sent and asked if the court could interpret tone. The judge raised an eyebrow. Lisa whispered something to Adam. He didn't look at me once. When it was over, the motion was denied. Unfounded, overreaching. The word dignity was used. So was autonomy. I left the courthouse without speaking to them. On the sidewalk outside, Joyce was waiting in her old green jacket, a cigarette in one hand and a thermos in the other. "Well," she said, "still yours then." I took the thermos, unscrewed the lid, and drank. Coffee, black, sharp, alive. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. I wrote a list, not of things to do, but of things I had reclaimed. my name, my choices, my breath, my space, my anger, my softness, my mornings. I thought about how many women I'd known who never got the chance. How many had disappeared so quietly, their own families forgot they were ever loud. I thought about my mother's hands, the way they used to rest on the table after dinner, folded but not resigned. I thought about the sound of my own voice in that courtroom, steady, low, undeniable. I thought, this is what it means to be seen, not loved, not needed, not used, seen. It's quieter now, in a way that doesn't ache. The kind of quiet you choose, not the kind that's handed to you like a punishment. Mornings begin slowly. I wake before the sun, the sky still wrapped in that bluish hush that reminds me of early church services and cold bathroom tiles. I stretch before I move. I speak my name aloud before I stand, not because I think I'll forget it, but because for too long I lived in rooms where no one said it with care. I make tea, I read, I work 3 days a week at the cafe, though Heather says I can cut back if I want. I don't want to. I like the way customers hand me coins like they matter, the way some of them look at me like I belong there, like I'm not a question mark in a place meant for younger bodies. I like the rhythm, the noise, the ritual of plates and mugs and crumbs wiped away. It's honest work, clean, and no one talks over me. When my shift ends, I walk home slowly through streets that no longer feel foreign. I know the lilac bush by smell now. I wave to the woman who always sits on her porch with knitting she never seems to finish. I stop sometimes to buy bread I don't need, just for the weight of it in my bag, just to hand it to Joyce when I get home and say, for later. She always grunts, but she slices it thick and passes me butter without asking. We don't say much, but she leaves the porch light on when I'm late. The letter from Kieran came last week, handwritten, 2 pages. He said he's starting college in the fall. He wants to study environmental policy. He said he remembers the time I took him to the creek behind the old library, the one with the frogs and the broken swing, and how I let him sit in the mud and told him dirt was honest. He said he wears the locket in his backpack, not around his neck, but close. He said he told his girlfriend about me, about who I really am. Not the ghost version, not the edited one, but me. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside the photo of him in the garden. I didn't cry. I just breathed a little deeper. Sometimes I think about Adam, not with rage, not even with sadness exactly, just with the kind of clarity that comes from no longer trying to explain myself to someone who only ever heard what threatened him. I think about how silence becomes a habit, how invisibility is something we often help them build, brick by brick, by not pushing back when they erase us gently. I don't regret leaving. I regret waiting so long to recognize that I had already been left. That chair by the wall wasn't an oversight. It was a placement, a message, a definition, and I accepted it for too many years because I thought love meant enduring. Now I understand love also means refusal. It means saying no to less than you deserve. It means standing up even if your knees shake, even if no one applauds. The notebook is full now. Each page a piece of myself I took back from silence. I haven't decided what to do with it. Maybe I'll keep it. Maybe I'll send it to Leah when she's older, when she's grown into a woman and the world begins to shrink her too. Maybe she'll read it and remember the way I used to let her braid my hair, how I never corrected her even when she twisted it into knots. Maybe she'll recognize the woman in these pages, not as a stranger or a story, but as someone she came from, as someone she might become. And maybe she'll make different choices, or maybe just the same choices, only sooner. There's a bench in the park now I've claimed as mine. It faces a crooked tree and a patch of wild flowers no one tends. I sit there often, coat buttoned, hands folded, watching. No one bothers me. Some people nod, a few smile, most just pass by. But I feel rooted, present, whole. There's a kind of power in being old and unmoved, in saying, without words, I am not waiting for you anymore. I am not watching the door. I am not hoping for the apology that will make it all make sense, because it won't. Some people leave you in rooms with no chairs. Others build you a seat beside them, even when there's barely space. I've learned the difference, and I've chosen mine. So if someone like me is listening, if a woman sits somewhere reading these words and wondering if she's asking too much just by existing, let me say this. You are not a burden. You are not too much. You are not the cause of the silence. You are the one who finally broke it. And that breaking, that soft rupture, it is not shame. It is survival. It is self-rescue. It is the sound of a door unlocking from the inside. And when you walk through it, even if it's into snow, even if no one follows, know this. You are not lost. You are found. Not by them, by yourself.